Hey everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat, your one-stop shop for everything going on in the world of Formula One. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and today we had a very exciting race. It was honestly such a breath of fresh air after Suzuka, and I feel like a lack of passing just in general with that race, to the point that I actually heard from some people that they slept through the race and then didn't bother to watch the replay after seeing how everyone reacted. Bahrain was a completely different story, and so I am very excited to be jumping into a recap of this week. But as always, before we even get into what happened on track, we have to talk about a couple of things that happened before the race itself started. A big news story in particular, in case you missed it, was that just before this race weekend kicked off, the FIA Deputy Director Robert Reid actually resigned from his post. To generally summarize the reason why he said he left, it had a lot to do with the idea of the moral system behind the FIA and the way that he feels the organization has changed over the years. He specifically said that he felt that critical decisions were being made without due process, and that he believes there has been a fundamental breakdown in governance standards. Overall, it was a pretty scathing review of where he feels the FIA stands. And what I think is interesting about this is that we have been seeing the FIA in particular go toe-to-toe with these drivers and the way that they are fined and all of these different aspects. We know that we were seeing a lot of conversation about this idea of them potentially being suspended for cursing on the radio. Last week, we saw Carlos Sainz hit with a very large penalty for being 5 seconds late to the national anthem, even after we found out the reason he was late to the national anthem was due to a medical tummy emergency. And yes, a doctor's note was provided. As Carlos actually said, shit happens. But what this resignation points to is that there is a bigger issue at hand with the FIA than just this kind of battle with the drivers, their language, and the way they present themselves. We've seen a general lack of consistency from the FIA when it comes to calling penalties. We've seen an increasing desire from the FIA to set standards and impose fines on drivers for expressing themselves. And I don't want to make the whole episode about this before we even get into such an incredible race, but I've talked about fines in particular a lot when it comes to the FIA. You guys know that I cover a ton of sports, and one of the things that is particularly glaring about the way that the FIA fines work is the fact that many other sports you actually know where those fines are going, because athletes being fined by their leagues or their governing bodies is not an abnormal thing. But there are a couple of things that are very abnormal about the FIA and the way that they fine drivers when you're comparing them to other sports. The first thing I'll point out is that the FIA actually regulates a number of leagues, so it's not just F1 drivers that are being subjected to these fines. And in addition, those fines in particular very often come with different standards for different drivers, things being waived for certain people and not being waived for others, and in addition, the fact that nobody knows where those fines actually go when the drivers pay them. When you look at other leagues like the NBA, the NFL, NHL, MLB, any of those leagues, and many other leagues, I'm just pointing those out in particular because I tend to cover those and I feel like people are more familiar with those leagues, all of the leagues that then fine their players in those leagues for various infractions, which could include like dangerous behavior in a game, dress code, or even sometimes with crude language or gestures when they're in the middle of a game or in a press conference. All of those things happen and are fined in other leagues. But the big point is when those fines are paid, there is a clear understanding of where all of the money goes. Sometimes a portion of the money goes towards charity. Sometimes a portion of the money is set aside for funds that go towards helping players in the future. Sometimes a portion of that money goes into the league, and it depends on which league you're talking about. But the thing is, every single one of them are very clear about where that money goes. The FIA has no standard whatsoever as to where that money goes. It's just paid into the FIA. And I think that is a portion of where this erosion of kind of trust between the FIA and the drivers as well as fans is going. Because it makes sense, you're fining drivers these large fines. And you set those fines at a high amount of money because when you talk about the amount of money these drivers make, you want it to actually cause an impact. The purpose of a fine is to keep someone from continuing to do that infraction. And sometimes it works, as you may know from the iconic meme of Marshawn Lynch going through an entire press conference answering every single question with, "I'm just here so I won't get fined." There is an intention behind fines, but when you don't know where any of that money is going, it becomes a just general sense of distrust for no reason. It would be very easy for the FIA to state, here's where we put the money and here's why we do it that way, or for them to work with the Drivers Association to agree on where those fines would go. And like I pointed out with many other leagues, the actual Players Association often has an aspect of receiving some of those fines and putting them towards their own funds. So if they were willing to have a conversation with the F1 drivers and come to a sort of agreement on not only where those fines go, but what type of things could be fined, I think you would have a different conversation. Obviously, we're covering a lot of the issues that are between the drivers and the FIA. But for Robert Reid to not only resign his post, but also to make it very clear as to why he was doing so and to really point at this sort of degradation of the accountability of the FIA as a whole is a little concerning, because this is the organization that is making all of those regulatory standards. And as we have suspected for a while, we don't necessarily always agree with their decisions. But now you have someone who is a part of making those decisions saying, I can no longer in good conscience work with this organization. So it'll be interesting to see if we start start to finally see some of that organization change, if people feel differently about their relationship with the FIA, and if we see some forced change. I think hoping for forced change from this might be a little optimistic, because also if someone like Robert Reed wanted things to change and was in a position of power to do so, it's unlikely that he would have resigned unless he felt that there was no chance of making a difference. I know that's a little bit of a pessimistic start to the episode, but it is something that is a big deal. The other piece of Formula One business news that we saw come out this week is that Liberty Media is seeking between $150 to $180 million for the streaming rights in the US of Formula One. Now, I've seen a couple of people online kind of balk at this number, saying that Formula One is not a big enough deal in the US for it to garner this amount of money, especially given that it would be more than double what ESPN was paying when they opted not to renew their contract. However, I think a lot of people are not taking a couple of things into account. One, right now, a big portion of the streaming war, so to speak, between Netflix and Amazon and Hulu and Disney Plus is about live sports. We have seen a very big shift in live sports overall, kind of moving into streaming for at least a portion of their rights for the season. The NHL has had games air exclusively on Amazon Prime. Last year, we saw the WNBA even have a couple of games exclusively on streaming services, including Disney Plus. We've seen NBA games do the same, and we've also seen Netflix in particular spend very large dollars for singular events. When we jump at this number of $150 to $180 million, it's easy to forget that Netflix in particular spent $170 million just on 2 games on Christmas Day from the NFL. Obviously, the NFL Christmas Day games are a very big deal, and there's a huge American audience for it. But when you compare 2 singular games that, yes, are event television, to the idea of the entirety of a season that runs from February all the way to December for potentially less or maybe $10 million more, the value is there, and you can really put that number into perspective. Streaming rights versus traditional broadcast rights are very different, and streamers right now are spending a lot of money on live sports as they also try to prove to these sporting leagues that they have the technology to actually broadcast live sports. Netflix I bring up in particular as that forerunner because not only are they spending big money on live sports, they've also spent a lot of money and had a lot of success in pushing their relationship forward with sports documentaries. And as we all know, Drive to Survive was a huge part of that. Not only is Netflix the home for Drive to Survive and responsible for making a lot of new Formula One fans, especially in the US, they also have the F1 Academy documentary series coming up. They hosted the live crossover between Full Swing and Drive to Survive in 2023. They've done live broadcasts with dating show reunions, and they have a literally incomparable number of sports documentary series that they put out nonstop. Just in recent memory, we had not only Drive to Survive, Full Swing, Breakpoint, Simone Biles' documentary that followed her going back to the Olympics, Receiver, which was an NFL show, a rugby show, the NASCAR show. There are so many shows on Netflix that are specifically centered on sports. And when you look at the value to Netflix of something like this, you have to look at what Netflix has to do, which is make sure that their subscribers don't have a reason to cancel month to month. So when they look at their numbers and they say, we're able to pull people in for Drive to Survive and it performs well, we're able to pull people into a show like Receiver and get them attached to various NFL players, or a show like Quarterback, same thing. Then not only are we able to do all of that, but then we're able to funnel current Formula One fans that already watch Formula One into Netflix as new viewers for the streaming rights of the actual broadcast. But we additionally keep those viewers who maybe don't have something else that's keeping them from canceling their subscription year round to finish Drive to Survive and then be suggested for the actual live broadcast or the replays of the races. For them, that's a huge value because you take someone who's going to find Formula One through Drive to Survive in the off season, and then the season starts very shortly after, and they have a reason to keep their subscription as they continue to watch the sport. Now, will Netflix be the one who wins it? I don't know, but I did want to point out just this idea of this number and why it actually is as big as it is. And I kind of forget to remind you guys that my background is in television and I went to film school. So a lot of this is sort of my bread and butter, and since I've seen a lot of conversation about it online about whether or not this makes sense, I did want to break it down a little bit as to why this number makes sense. Now let's get into some of the updates that affected the racing on track before the lights went out. We know Ferrari actually brought an upgraded floor to the race this weekend, and one of the issues they've been having is how low to the ground they're able to run, and that both drivers have confirmed that they're running higher than the team would like them to be. Part of that we know is compensation for the fact that Lewis Hamilton was actually disqualified for running too low to the ground, and he had that skid block issue. It is clear now 4 races in that both Ferrari drivers are unhappy with the car and not getting the performance that they're looking for. So I do think we're going to continue to see them attempt to bring tweaks and upgrades as they go through the season. And hopefully the long-suffering Ferrari fans will eventually see some improvement. Heading into this weekend, our driver standings were pretty clear. Lando Norris was ahead in the championship by 1 point. Max Verstappen was right behind him after his Suzuka win last week. And waiting in the wings, we had Lando Norris's teammate Oscar Piastri. So as we get into qualifying, we have a couple of things to talk about. Obviously, Oscar Piastri takes a very very incredible pole position and just pretty much lays it down the entirety of qualifying. That car was very clearly hooked up, and so was the driver. Conversely, we saw Lando really struggle in qualifying, and that's what opened the door for Oscar to be able to compete this week and also bring himself a little bit ahead in that driver standings. A couple of other things to point out going into this race from qualifying are, again, frustrations with the FIA and late actual penalties. Both Mercedes drivers were handed a single grid penalty for being released from the garage before the session had turned green, and while that being delayed is not a really big deal because it didn't affect the actual grid, one that was a really big deal and did cause a lot of issues was Alex Albon getting Hulk smashed by the FIA. If you're still confused as to how qualifying works, a very simple understanding of it is that we have 3 sessions in qualifying, and in sessions 1 and 2, the 5 slowest drivers in each session are eliminated. The last session is the final 10, and those final 10 set their fastest lap, and that gives them their grid position. Alex Albon was passed by Nico Hülkenberg on his final lap. But here's what's unfortunate. Nico Hülkenberg actually had a track limits violation, and his time should have been deleted. It ultimately was, but not until 45 minutes after the actual end of Q1, which meant that instead of Alex Albon getting to participate in Q2 as he should have been able to and then improve his position, Nico Hülkenberg was able to run the entirety of Q2. And when that penalty was handed down, ultimately Nico actually drops down into 16th and Alex takes that 15th slot. However, the frustrating part here is that if he had been allowed to compete in Q2, he would have at the very least ended up in P14, because we saw Esteban Ocon crash into the barriers and be unable to complete the session. But because of how the session was run, Esteban ends up taking P14 and Alex only inherits P15. And all that being said, after qualifying, we saw Alex say that it was not getting the traffic right in that first qualifying session, and so I don't think we actually saw the full performance of Alex and his car this weekend. And if he had been able to move into Q2 and get a fresh start, we could have seen him make it all the way to Q3 again and start in the top 10 once more. This is one of the most frustrating calls from qualifying for me, and maybe the most frustrating call of the entire weekend, because Alex and Williams have been performing so well, and this felt like just getting kicked in the teeth for no reason. We genuinely have no idea how well Alex could have performed if he had been given a chance to do so. At bare minimum, he would have started 1 position higher, and at most, he could have been in that top 10 slot, especially given the fact that Carlos Sainz, his teammate who has not been able to get the car underhand, did make it into Q3. So I feel like this is one of those calls where we talk about it actually is race changing, and it actually is kind of points changing, because we had a chance for the first time to see both Williams actually start in the top 10 of the grid. But alas, here we are. Lastly, we obviously had Esteban Ocon have that crash, which was really rough. And to cap off qualifying, there's one other huge placement, and that was Yuki making it to Q3 in a Red Bull for the very first time. So that sort of sets the stage before the race. Let's get into the race itself. Like I mentioned at the top of this episode, if you watched this race, you know it was a very exciting one, and it was one that was just honestly thrilling to watch. Right from the very onset, we had huge amounts of passing. We see Oscar get away with a very good start, but we also see a lot of movement right at the top of the grid. George Russell quickly makes it back up to second past Charles Leclerc. Lando Norris also passes Charles, and we see Carlos Sainz make his way up to 6th. Plus, we also saw a lot of movement towards the back of the grid, and we start Ollie Bearman's incredible run this weekend. So there are a couple of major stories from this race. If we start with McLaren as a whole, we see Oscar very much hold this race from the very beginning and just maintain that gap, and it shows how much pace that car really has. But we also see Lando Norris struggle throughout the entire weekend. He couldn't seem to get the pace for a lap during qualifying that would have put him in a position to really perform for this race, and he's hit very quickly with a 5-second time penalty for actually having a false start. He was past his grid box when it was time to start the race, and one Max Verstappen made sure to tattle on him on the radio to make sure the FIA saw. However, when we look at McLaren, we have to acknowledge a couple of things just for both of their races. And I want to start with them because they're one of the more cut and dry aspects of this race, and also where a lot of our focus is for the full season because of how the driver standings are. Oscar, first and foremost, dominated this weekend. And there's not a ton of individual things to talk about with his race because of how well he performed the entire time. He starts on pole, he leads the race at the start, and he manages to hold that lead throughout the race, even when later on we have a safety car restart. And so what I think Oscar really showed during this race is that he has that stamina to be a leader in a race, but he also has the ability to manage a restart. He managed pit stops. He managed to hold that race the entire time and to sound pretty cool as a cucumber doing it. And then on the flip side of McLaren, we look at Lando, who, while he did not have a great start to the weekend and gets that 5-second penalty, the one thing I do want to point out is there was exactly one thing thing Lando had to do if he wanted to maintain that WDC lead. He had to make it onto the podium if Oscar was going to win the race. And so while he did not catch up to Oscar, he did start this race in 6th and finish 3rd. And we saw him really have to fight his way through, even getting to the point that he had pushed so hard we did see him get a black and white flag for track limits, which if you're not familiar with those types of warnings or what they mean, track limits is when your car, all 4 tires, go over the white line of the racetrack. And when that happens, your lap time is deleted. But that doesn't mean that they force you to do another lap if you hit track limits. During a qualifying scenario, like what happened with Nico Hülkenberg, they just delete the lap and it no longer counts towards that qualifying session. But during a racing scenario, you have a limit. And so if you're getting a black and white flag for track limits, it means that you are at that limit. And the next one is going to result in a time penalty. We saw a number of drivers get that black and white flag and keep themselves into the track limits to keep from having that time penalty. But it was something that was definitely an issue with how fast and furious we were racing this week. And so I do want to point out that Lando, despite having kind of a rocky weekend, did have a strong drive and do what had to be done in order for him to keep that lead. Even with Oscar winning the race, he still maintains a 3-point lead in the championship in the end of this. And so I think we really have to give props where props are due for Oscar, because he not only was able to put everything together and win that race, he also held off George Russell behind him and managed to maintain that lead even with a safety car. So this is an expert utilization of that car from Oscar, but it was also a strong recovery from Lando, because when you keep in mind that he had a 5-second time penalty as well, the race could have been even closer than it actually ended up being. Had Lando not had that false start, you could also argue that maybe he wouldn't have gotten as many positions up at the top that he did, but he may not have had that 5-second penalty, and we may have seen those McLarens end up 1-2 or even fight for the finish. So I think when we look at it, we have to remember how strong not only both of these drivers are, but how strong that McLaren is. Because we are getting into a position where it seems like that drivers' championship may just be neck and neck between Lando and Oscar. And that's kind of the McLaren race story. Not a lot left on the table. Lando definitely could have improved in certain positions, but ultimately both of them end up on the podium, and we continue to see this McLaren performance of a little bit of dominance. The next race story that we have to talk about is George Russell, because I think there has been a situation with George where, despite his high performance, we continue to talk about George getting lucky or kind of glossing over his performance. And George has been on the podium 3 of the first 4 races of the season. And his race this weekend was actually really impressive. Not only do we have to look at his tire strategy and managing those soft tires for 2 different stints, but we also have to look at the fact that his car was just actively falling apart this entire race. One of the major issues that you may have found yourself being frustrated about with the coverage was his transponder, which is a piece of tech in the car that allows everybody to see where he is on the track, and we were continually seeing his kind of lap times not show up. We were seeing him suddenly drop from 2nd to 20th until the broadcast ultimately decided to just turn off the actual listing. And then we were also seeing trouble from other teams not being able to see where he was and how they could use DRS. This became an even bigger issue later on in the race because George actually could not tell when he was within DRS and when he wasn't, and that had to be shifted to a manual detection from his engineer to be called for him. That was approved by race control due to the issues that his car was having. But when you realize how much of this sport is about data and about precision, and you recognize that George was actively losing more and more data throughout the race, not being able to see where he was, not being able to see where he was in relation to the other cars and with cars behind him, having to look at DRS from a manual standpoint and also rely on his engineer's timing. And also, as we heard over the radio, he was also losing the dashboard. And at a certain point, he said, as long as the steering wheel stays on, I'll finish the race. And I kind of joked about this, but it almost felt like by the end, he was going to be running a Flintstone car. Like every lap, he seemed to be losing a certain portion of that car and the tech behind it. And so for him to be able to be dealing with all of that and also make his way not only to finish the race, but to finish second and maintain that position was rather, as he put it, audacious. Also, one of you guys in the Discord server said that George actually speaks like an author, and I found that so funny because we talk so much about radio behavior and radio culture and whether it's okay to curse or yell at your race engineer. And George is always coming back with these little quips on the radio that you're like, it makes you laugh in time because it feels ridiculous, but it's also funny and very characteristic of him for things like this is rather audacious when he's talking about just being on a soft tire until the end of the race. George has so many little one-liners and almost like quirky behavior things. He's got his T-pose, he's got his yabba dabba do, and whether you like it or you don't like it, it is at least a characteristic that's happening for him. And I think the honest thing right now is to say that he has been performing very well this season. And I also think it's worth pointing out that he absolutely has to be. George Russell is one of the few drivers whose contract expires at the end of this season. As we're seeing, Kimi Antonelli is becoming the focus of the future of this team. That has been very well stated by Toto Wolff, and Kimi has also been putting up a performance so far that make it clear that he does have the type of potential potential we've been talking about. And so with that being said, George himself needs to be performing at a high level, which he is doing at this very beginning of the season, because at the end of the season, he needs to have a contract completed either with Mercedes or with someone else if he wants to stay on the grid. Right now, he has to prove his value, because as we get into silly season, it will be a question of whether or not George is renewing at Mercedes, if there's an opportunity for him elsewhere, and if he can create competition for himself and drive his contract up. All of that being said, I will say cool down room would have preferred if everyone kept their clothes on. Gonna put it out there. Next, let's talk about Williams, because as we know, this weekend could have gone so much better for them than it did. And this honestly feels like the biggest hiccup that they have had this whole season. Williams has been really surprisingly strong as we've started the season out. Alex Albon has been qualifying very high, and he has been in the points as well. This has been a situation where we have not only not expected that type of performance from a Williams, but we also have not expected that level of consistency from the Williams team. On the other side of the garage, we have had Carlos not really be able to get there yet. And again, I think when we look at these different teams, we look at drivers moving across the grid, we look at Carlos dropping down from a Ferrari to a Williams, and you're learning a completely new setup, a completely new team, a completely new car. It is understandable that it takes you time to adjust to that. But Carlos has been in that adjustment period. And so now we come to this race this weekend, where Alex Albon is unfairly knocked out of Q1 and isn't given an opportunity to improve upon his position. And Carlos Sainz actually makes it all the way to Q3, but then has a pretty abysmal race story. Carlos ultimately ends up DNFing this race with damage, and so he drops all the way from the top of the grid to not even finishing the race. Alex does finish the race but doesn't make it into the points, and it really sucks, but we go from this really big high for the team and for Alex in particular to one car not even finishing the race and having damage that needs to be repaired, and the other car not making it into the points. I think what sucks about this for Williams is that it felt like things were finally coming together for them in a way that it really has not been. We already knew going in that Alex had this amount of pressure that was coming in from not only having just renewed his contract and becoming the star of the team to then very quickly shifting to having Carlos as his teammate and all of the fanfare and kind of drama that went into that contract getting done. But then we start seeing this incredible performance from Alex, and then he gets robbed out of his qualifying this weekend, and we don't see him be able to make it through the grid in a way that would get him high enough to actually score points. And so he breaks that streak, and then you have Carlos ultimately seem like he maybe has control of this car for the first time, and then we've got contact and we've got a DNF. I am hopeful that this is just kind of a hiccup because I actually love an underdog story. And so this idea of Carlos going from a top team all the way down to the bottom, Alex Albon being expected to underperform in comparison to his teammate and then suddenly rocketing into the points, this felt like a week that had so much potential for Williams and then just ultimately fell apart in some ways that are their fault and some ways that aren't. Hopefully this is just a blip on the radar for them and we move forward in a position where we actually see them perform well and enjoy themselves. And then next we have Ollie Bearman, which honestly could have been my driver of the day as much as I love Lewis Hamilton and I will always cheer for my man. But the thing about Ollie's drive is this was the first week it felt like we were getting a little bit of focus on him as a rookie. One of the things about this season is that we have 6 rookies on the grid and that there was a range of experience for these rookies coming in, which also meant there was a range of expectations for them coming in. Those 6 rookies, in case you don't remember, are Isaac Hadjar and Liam Lawson, both at VCarb, Gabriel Bortoleto at Stake, Kimi Antonelli at Mercedes, Jack Doohan at Alpine, and Ollie Bearman at Haas. But as we were coming into this season, there were a couple of those rookies that actually had kind of experience that others didn't. Kimi Antonelli, I think, had the most pressure in terms of expectations. He's coming into a very high-level team with no experience and is so young. Not only so young, like, oh, he's 18, he's so young, but also he's actively still going to high school in between races. He's also not old enough to drive a supercar on the street in Italy. Kimi Antonelli is very, very, very young. And he's at a top-level team driving pretty well. So he was coming in with a lot of expectation, but not a lot of proof of experience as he had never driven in a Formula 1 Grand Prix before. Conversely, both Ollie Bearman and Liam Lawson were coming in with a high level of experience in Formula 1. Liam Lawson obviously had much more experience than Ollie did, given that Liam Lawson had actually competed in enough Formula 1 Grand Prix that he had not actually qualified to be a rookie this season, technically speaking. And then Ollie has this huge story of filling in for Carlos Sainz at Ferrari and driving so very well, with really no practice and very little warning. So those 2 rookies are the ones who've come in with this expectation of you know what you're doing to some degree. And obviously one of the big stories last week was that we saw Liam Lawson get dropped from Red Bull back down to VCarb. Ollie Bearman has kind of been quietly making his way through the beginning of this season. Nothing too dramatic like a crash from Jack Doohan, nothing too exciting like Isaac Hadjar's performance that we've been seeing, or Kimi Antonelli in the rain, just sort of making his way through quietly. And then we get to this week's race for Ollie, where he goes from P20 P20 on the grid all the way up to P10 to score points. The other thing about this weekend for Ollie that I really loved was the end of his race when everyone came on the radio to tell him how good of a job he had done. Because the thing is, when we talk about these types of movements, where we talk about someone coming all the way from the back of the grid and making it into the points, it is impressive regardless of what their status is, what their experience level is, and what car they're in. For example, last season we even saw Max Verstappen come from the back of the grid to win a race, and that was huge. But this feels like an even bigger deal when it's a driver who is a rookie in a midfield car coming from P20 all the way up to the points itself. And so it was just so sweet to hear everybody coming over the radio, congratulating him, telling him how good of a job he did, and then to kind of put the actual end on the race weekend for him with his dad telling him he was proud of him over the radio. When that radio message started and I heard, "Ollie, it's your dad," oh man, I was ready to cry. It was so sweet and absolutely such a sweet moment in general, but also just such an incredibly impressive drive from Ollie. And I would say if we're comparing rookies, which we're always going to be all season, this week was Ollie's week 100%, and absolutely a race to remember, and also sort of this driver of the day type of energy that I probably think he could have really earned. And I was kind of surprised not to see him up at the top, except for the fact that this race in terms of the broadcast itself really did skip over quite a bit that was happening, because for one of the first times in a while, we've seen a lot of action happening all the way up and down the grid. So trying to figure out where to point that camera, where to direct the attention of the viewer did seem like we were missing some action in various places throughout the race. And Haas's race story as a whole was one that seemed to get lost in the broadcast, because we also saw Esteban do a very good job. We have our first double points finish for Haas. And I think their race story deserved a little bit more attention than it got in the broadcast itself. And hopefully if we're covering it, other people are covering it too, and we'll see a little bit more excitement around the success of this team. Because actually Haas as a whole is a team that has been working so hard to get to the level that they're at now. Their team principal, Io, has been doing a great job since taking over. And last year was the first year that the team actually turned a profit. So we're heading into this year with a much better situation. And we see both of these drivers have a really terrible qualifying, with Ollie coming in 20th and Esteban actually crashing out, to see the team not only rebuild Esteban's car, but to get both of those drivers into the points in the finish. Very incredible race weekend for Haas. Next, speaking of rookies, we have Kimi Antonelli's race. And I want to point out the fact that I think Kimi actually would have done better if he had had a slightly different pit strategy, where we saw Kimi pit and come in for new tires. We also saw him get kind of stuck in what's called a DRS train. If you hear that on the broadcast and you're wondering what that means, essentially what it means is that the cars are so close in racing that we see them all get grouped up to the point that every car in front of and behind for a certain amount of cars has DRS on the car in front of them, which means that you don't really see those cars able to pass because the car that you're trying to pass in front of you in those zones has DRS on the car in front of them, which means that they're getting that same speed boost that you're getting attempting to overtake. And so instead we just see this group of cars that stays kind of in those same positions. Everybody's turning on DRS because they're all staying within that 1 second, but nobody's actually able to use DRS and the boost that it gives you to actually pass the car in front of you. That's what happened for Kimi. And it just sucks because it means that he comes from a pretty strong qualifying. He had that P4 qualifying time and then gets that 1 grid penalty, dropping him down to P5. And then he ends up in P7 after pitting and gets stuck in this DRS train and just can't move. And so for that, we just see him not really be able to have a great race, not because he's not a great driver, but because of his position and the way that everything kind of shook out. So I think had we seen Kimi have a little bit better timing in his pit strategy, we may have also seen him have a stronger finish to the race itself, and we might have seen some of the same impressive level of driving that we saw from George. And then we also have Red Bull. We know that they have been struggling with this car, but I think this week really showed how much. Last week we had this huge yo-yo situation where we've seen everybody struggling, but then Max comes in and just obliterates that lap and takes pole position, and then completely dominates the race and takes a 4th win at Suzuka. 4th win at Suzuka meaning like he's actually won Suzuka 4 years in a row. Then we come into this race and we just don't see that at all. They really struggle in qualifying, even though we see Yuki do a very good job in terms of what he has to do to perform for this team to justify that driver swap, and then we just really can't see them move through the race. Max at one point after pitting actually drops down to 20th and does make his way back up into the points eventually, and then Yuki does manage to keep himself in the points. But one thing that we have to point out with both of these drivers is that not only is the car giving them trouble, but this race was completely botched for both of them because of their pit stops. Something was wrong with the light on the pit stop. So if you watch the lights when a driver comes in for a pit stop, you'll see a red light that's on while they're having their pit stop go through, and then you will see that light switch to green. For both Yuki and Max's first pit stop, we did not see that light change. And so they both lost a significant amount of time by simply just not being able to release their car and drive back into the track. That light is keeping you from having an unsafe release where you could have somebody else coming up the pit lane, and you would not only potentially have a problem in terms of running into someone, but you would also have a penalty if it was truly an unsafe release. So both of these drivers didn't do anything wrong by not driving off because they didn't have that signal from the light turning from red to green, but it was clearly a technical difficulty that should have been changed. Then Max, on top of that, his second pit stop, the tire gets stuck, and we see him lose a lot of time there. So this race, when you look at it for both Red Bulls, it's hard for us to look at their positions and say like, oh, this was a fine enough race for Red Bull, because we're used to seeing Red Bull right at the top dominating. But when you take into account the botches that they had in their pit stops, and you realize that they're able to actually manage to both stay in the points, Yuki doing so for the first time in 175 days for that second Red Bull seat, it's clear that we actually see a little bit more performance than we were expecting, and also without those stops, it would have been interesting to see where they ended up in the final classification. Because I do think Yuki has kind of shown that from this race especially, he is starting to prove, or at least doing what he has to eventually prove, that moving him into that seat was the right decision. Because in 2 weeks, we've seen him break a 175-day streak of no points for the second Red Bull seat. So to see both Max and Yuki still perform in the face of their technical issues is a really good sign, because it's easy to look at the face of this and say that this was a bad race for Red Bull, which it was. But if you actually look down at the details and say we had a good driver performance despite technical issues outside of their control, what happens when we're actually able to fix those issues? If we can make sure that the light doesn't go out at the pit stop again, that we don't have an issue where we're taking a tire off and it gets stuck, and we can fix some of these issues in the car itself that we're seeing the drivers complain about. When you look at their classification of both of them finishing in the points, Yuki doing so for the first time in a really long time for that second driver seat, if we fix those issues, how much better do those drivers perform? And do we finally have the driver lineup that we need, that if we had a car that was performing at the level that a Red Bull used to be, this driver lineup would be outperforming a different one? And I think we may be seeing that proof there. We are seeing Yuki really quickly adapt to this car. We're seeing Max be able to pull performance out of a car that he shouldn't be able to. And we saw both of them finish in the points despite the fact that they just actively got stuck in their pit stops and that the car is not performing at the rate that either of them would like to see. All of that being said, imagine if they are getting better machinery and they actually are able to upgrade that. Because it's easy to look at the season so far and say, McLaren is so dominant and they are going to win this season. But it's important to remember that we are only 4 races into a 24-round season. And at this point last season, we thought Red Bull was in the exact same position that we're talking about McLaren being in. And we know how that turned out. McLaren brought these upgrades and continually upgraded the car, and around Miami last year is where we start to see the tide shift. So it is very possible that we see a change in Red Bull's car and we see the drivers that they now have focus in and be able to compete. I would not write either of them off yet. I wouldn't write Red Bull as a team off yet. And I would remember that a Formula One season is a very long one. So from this performance for Red Bull's race story, I would say what's important to look at is that I do think we have a driver lineup that can compete properly as soon as they are given the machinery that they need. And as soon as we don't see other mistakes come in, because I would have really loved to have seen, had we not had those pit stop issues, even with the issues that we were having in terms of pace, where would both of these drivers have finished? And what will we see from them moving forward as hopefully Red Bull continues to adjust? Either way, I do think it's important to look at and say that Yuki has kind of done the things that he needed to do so far to prove and quiet any conversation about whether or not moving him into the seat was the right decision. As brutal as it was for Liam, we are already seeing a quick adjustment from Yuki to this Red Bull. We are already seeing him out-qualify where Liam was, and for the first time in 175 days, that second seat has scored points. Big deal, big excitement, and I'm very happy for Yuki and for his performance so far. And then a couple of other points. We had a safety car in the middle of the race, and we did see many drivers get a second pit stop for free, so to speak. We also saw Oscar be able to hold his own with the restart, and I will say it was never completely clear exactly why we got a full safety car here. Nobody crashed, and it did seem to be debris on the track, though from our broadcast, it was never very clear where that debris was or who it had been dropped by. And we have seen different calls previously by the FIA to not actually call a full safety car for something like this, though we've also seen that result in damage to the cars. In the moment, it seemed very odd that they were calling a full safety car for something like this and risking bunching the grid up, which could ultimately have changed the final classification of who won the race itself. However, safety cars always happen. It's something that you have to be able to fight through. And ultimately, the stewards made the call that they needed a full safety car in order to be able to clear the track and keep it safe. Did it seem odd in the moment? Absolutely. Was there probably a reason behind it? Yes. Was that reasoning consistent with other calls that have been made in the past? No. But what are you going to do? The FIA kind of seems to do what they want to do each week. Regardless, I think in terms of safety precaution, things like that, if there was a possibility that something was on the track that could have caused damage to a car that would have been dangerous for the driver, obviously they needed to do what they needed to do to be able to clear that track and keep them safe. Then we have a ton of track limits violations from what felt like everybody. We have a DNF from Carlos and a final DSQ for Nico Hülkenberg. Nico's disqualification was the same reason that Lewis was disqualified a few races ago, meaning that he was running too low to the ground and that skid block was caused to have too much wear and tear, which is an automatic disqualification. All of that being said, I really loved this race, and I think that's because of how exciting the passing was, which kind of begs a bigger conversation when it comes to the types of tracks that we're still racing on. There are some tracks like Suzuka and Monaco where we don't see any passing at all happen, and that's because of the actual width of the track and how big Formula One cars have gotten. In years previous, cars were a lot smaller, which meant that a narrower track still allowed for a lot of passing. And so sometimes we end up with these races, like at Suzuka or Monaco in particular, where we see the race get completely determined by the qualification order. So if you get pole position, it's most likely that you are going to win, and that we don't get a lot of excitement in the race itself of drivers moving around. That doesn't mean that those races are always boring or that they're not worth having, but the question when we have a race that is exciting like this one was, where we're seeing passing left and right and drivers being able to move from the back of the grid up to P10, or drivers like Max being able to come out of a pit stop, hit 20th and come all the way back into the points, or drivers like Lewis Hamilton move from P9 to P5. The question really becomes like, is that what we want to see from Formula One racing? And if so, should we be considering changing some of these tracks that don't allow for that, given how much the cars have evolved? The wider a car gets, the harder it's going to be for a car to pass and have passing in racing and have a lot of kind of grid changes and people excited about that, meaning that the more narrow tracks that we keep on the kind of circuit overall, we continue to not have as exciting racing there. And so I think sometimes it's a track by track case. Tracks that are as historic as Monaco are hard to want to give up just because of this type of change to the car and a lack of passing. It's hard to say that we should remove something like that from the excitement of Formula One as a whole and the history and the tapestry of the sport. But then at the same time, you go into a race like this where you're like, wow, back to back, I think really highlights it, where Suzuka has no passing and Bahrain has an insane amount of passing. Which one is better for the sport? Do we keep a balance of it? Do we keep some races that are ultimately going to be more boring no matter what? Or do we try to focus on tracks that allow this type of passing and this type of exciting racing? I think it's an overall existential question for Formula One as a sport, and I'm not sure what the answer is, because there are some tracks that you want to see stay on the calendar no matter what, but at the same time, there's something very electric about watching a race like Bahrain, where we're seeing people move around and it doesn't really matter where people qualified because there is so much movement. And I think there's something really exciting about a race being so exciting that things get lost in the broadcast, as much as I would prefer that things that, didn't get lost at all. I would like to have 14 screens and 12 different people directing and let me watch everything that I need to watch, but that's not the point. The point is there's something really exciting about watching a race like this, where no matter what time you're waking up, for me it was 8 a.m., you are locked in from the very beginning, versus a race like Suzuka where you do have to get up early and you're trying to fight to stay awake for a race that doesn't involve a ton of on-track action. So again, like I said, not a real answer. There is an existential question in Formula One that we're seeing a lot of pundits talk about and try to figure out what the right answer is. All I know is I very much enjoyed watching this race, and that personally for me, I enjoy more on-track action than less. I fear that's not really a hot take, but we'll see when we see the comments and the response to this episode. And that kind of covers the race as a whole. Obviously, like I said, there was so much action, but in the interest of not making this episode as long as the race itself, those are the highlights that I wanted to run through. Those are the race stories I wanted to run through. And now we can dive into your questions from the race, your hot takes, and your predictions for next week. Okay, let's dive into questions first. First question, do you think George will get a penalty for DRS shenanigans? I'm actually glad someone asked this because I realize now in the recap we did not go through this. Part of what was going on with George's car was the fact that his transponder, which gives the timing for him, was completely blinking in and out. That was part of why you were seeing his position drop from second all the way down to the back of the grid. At one point it seemed like he had pitted, but it was because we didn't see where he was and his transponder had just completely dropped off. That was also affecting DRS. You heard it come into place in two different positions. One, we heard George's engineer come over the radio and tell him that they were going to have to switch to a manual DRS activation and that he would only be allowed to press DRS when he was told by the engineer that he was clear to do so. This was because at the DRS detection point, George's transponder was not working, so they could not activate DRS for him. So race control gave the authority to Mercedes to be able to do so manually, meaning that at the DRS detection point, they were able to see we are within the second that's required to allow DRS, and then when they were actually in the DRS zone, they were telling him when it was okay to open it. The possible penalty that we were seeing was coming from the fact that at a certain point, George opened DRS when he should not have been able to do so. This actually ended up not being penalized by the FIA stewards because they stated that essentially what happened was that the button that he pressed for the radio also had the option to manually open DRS. So when he pressed that radio button trying to talk to the team, he unintentionally opened DRS and did gain a small advantage. However, the reason they said they ultimately decided not to penalize him, which would have been a 5-second penalty and changed him from second position all the way down to fourth, promoting Charles to the actual podium, was the fact that it was not only unintentional and due to technical difficulties, but also the fact that he lost the same amount of time in trying to compensate for it later in the same lap. Their argument is that ultimately it ended up costing him time, not gaining him an advantage. It was a clear mistake, and there was no reason to penalize it. What I will say is it's hard because we don't see these hard and fast rules, it seems. We see the FIA fine Carlos Sainz last week for being 5 seconds late to the national anthem with a doctor's note, but we see George Russell not receive a penalty given the fact that he didn't really mean to do it. All that being said, definitely there was a possibility that we would have seen that penalty and it would have changed the ultimate classification of the race. Whether or not it should have been done is hard to say. Ultimately, it was not because of what the FIA said. What I will say is, again, like I said before, I do think it was pretty impressive to be able to drive with a car essentially falling apart around you. At one point, they told him he was going to lose his entire dash. He obviously was lost on his own timing and when he could use DRS and when he couldn't. And then in addition, we saw this possible penalty. So whether the penalty had happened or not, I still would have said it was an impressive race from George. Whether the penalty should have happened or not kind of depends on your feelings on the FIA and how they treat certain drivers versus others. Also, I will say that a lot of the questions I got were specifically about George's car, what was going on, and why it was falling apart. So hopefully that does answer your question as a whole. George's transponder was not there, and then things seemed to technically start to fall off across the board. Hopefully they fix it for him before the next race, and if not, we'll get to see what George looks like when he's running the car with his own feet. And then the other big question that I got repeated a couple of times was about the safety car. The question really comes down to the fact that I actually don't feel like I know the answer either. There was some sort of debris on the track that must have been on the racing line itself that the FIA felt the only way to clear would be to put a safety car out there. Obviously not intense enough to red flag, does not necessarily line up with the calls that they have made previously, but we also never really saw what was removed from the track and why, at least on the F1 TV broadcast, and what would have required them to have a safety car itself in order to kind of close down the race and bring them slow enough for a marshal to get on track. Whatever it was, I have to assume that it could have caused severe damage to the car, could have created a much more dangerous situation for the drivers on the track, and they needed to clear it. But yes, while we were watching it, I was very confused, the broadcasters were very confused, and maybe the drivers themselves were confused. I was actively looking for someone in the barrier and we never really saw that. And again, we found out that it was ultimately debris. And this one is not a question. It's actually should have been put in the hot take section, but since you put it in the questions, we're going to resolve it. And it's also one I disagree with, which is why is Lando Norris such a crybaby? I am seeing a weird amount of Lando Norris hate for something that doesn't really make sense to me. Honestly, when we get into the opinion section of this podcast versus the talent and fact section of this podcast, which is where we are right now, we're in the opinion section. Personally, I would like to see Lando take the championship this year. I'm always rooting for my favorite drivers and those types of things, but Lando himself, I think, really had a lot to improve on from last year. I think he did a lot of that work and I think he came in improved. And so what's stressful ultimately is that McLaren's trouble last year was the fact that they couldn't pick between their drivers. And so for me, just personally and my own anxiety, I guess, I would like for Lando to be able to kind of win that championship. And I think it would be cool to see him do it. I would think it would be cool to also see him kind of fly in the face of what people have said, what I myself have commentated on before in this idea of needing to be a little bit more cutthroat as a person in order to be a champion. I think people get confused about that conversation and about this idea of not being allowed to be nice versus being kind of that version of yourself that allows you to put yourself first and be a little bit more selfish. I think that's the part that Lando was missing, not this idea that he needs to be a bad person or a mean person. But I think Lando has been really clear that there are certain risks he has watched other drivers who have won championships take that he's not willing to take himself. Whether that is putting other drivers on track into dangerous situations, or you're talking about something like Fernando Alonso, where he has this very famous quote where he says he knew the other driver would hit the brakes because he has a wife and kids at home and Fernando doesn't. Those types of things, I think, are the type of energy that Lando is afraid of and doesn't want to kind of be that type of driver or that type of person. And I think it would be a good narrative and a really cool thing to see him not have to change who he is as a person, not necessarily have to be that cutthroat and still win a championship. Because with Lando, I think it would be a really good narrative to see him actually become this person who either can win by not changing who he is, where he doesn't have to take sort of a cutthroat or dangerous approach on the track itself, where he can kind of race clean and race the way he wants to, or to see if he's willing to push himself past a certain point of comfort and to make those changes and to take those risks and to put himself first in that type of place. Do we see him want to win badly enough to do that? I think it would be interesting for me personally as a fan to see which version of Lando wins a championship. Does he get to stick to this nice guy thing that he really wants? Does he kind of cross his own lines in certain capacities? Which one is it? All of that being said, crybaby energy, I don't think so this weekend. I think he kind of took responsibility for his mistakes. We saw him say after the race that he spent some time at the track late at night after qualifying, trying to figure out what he had done wrong and why he didn't feel so comfortable. And hopefully we'll see an improvement next week. We also saw him force himself back onto the podium to maintain that lead, even knowing Oscar was going to kind of get much closer to him and potentially surpass him, which he didn't allow him to do. So, crybaby, I don't think so. Maybe not his best performance, obviously, but very much still locked in and hopefully stays locked in and kind of brings us a better performance next week. And now we're moving into that hot take section I just said we should have been in before. And I'm going to say most of these are about Oscar and Lando and McLaren, which is not surprising. Let's start at the very beginning. They need to accept that Oscar is their number one driver. Personally, I actually don't think that we're at a position where either of the drivers have proven that they are better than the other yet. I personally think it's too early to kind of decide that. We're only 4 races into this season. There are 24 races, and we are clearly going to be a neck and neck situation between the two of them. But right now, it's healthy competition. Both of these drivers have said that the other driver forces them to be a better driver. Lando himself has said that it makes him a better driver to have Oscar up and breathing down his neck. And Oscar hasn't outperformed Lando at a point yet until this race. Last race, you absolutely could argue that there was a potential that he could have caught Lando past him. A lot of different arguments on that scenario. But again, 4 races. Neither of them has outperformed the other completely, and I think it's too early on to say which one of them is the actual better driver. How will the papaya rules affect the championship title between 4 and 81? This is a great question and something that I worry about. Keeps me up at night. If we finish this season the way that we are going right now, I worry that we may be in Nico Rosberg, Lewis Hamilton territory, which for those of you who are new to Formula One, you really should look up Brosades or the Silver War, whichever version of it you want to look at. I've made plenty of videos on the topic, and if you listen to the Mercedes history episode of this podcast, you will also hear a pretty strong breakdown. But that was a really strongly bad portion of kind of teammate behavior. And I worry that we'll see something similar if we don't see McLaren eventually, not right now, make that priority clear when we get to a point that they are in a point of the season that they need to in terms of both constructors and drivers championship. But if they're winning constructors to a point that is so strong that those two drivers are 1-2 regardless, it's very possible we see them say, you guys can race it out. Because if we see them run away with the Constructors' Championship, and from that we're seeing them go 1-2, Oscar and Lando, Lando and Oscar, and shifting back and forth, there's nothing to say that there's a reason to prioritize one of those drivers over the other. If there is no close competition, then allow them to kind of race it out and see who wins, which then obviously turns into a situation where you could have some very big tension between the two of them. So we'll see how it all shakes out. Hopefully everything is okay, but I just don't think we are at a point in the season where we're strong enough to kind of say which one of them deserves to be prioritized over the other. I think right now what we have is that everyone has a driver that they personally would like to see prioritized, but that we're not at a point where it actually matters from a team standpoint who they should do so with. And then we have 2 more that are about Lando and his championship mindset. One just says Lando is never going to be a champion, and another says, as a huge Lando fan, if he doesn't get his mindset right, he's not going to win the WDC. I disagree with Lando's never going to be champion, but I do think that there's this idea of his mindset and needing to lock in. Though again, I want to point out this idea of recency bias when it comes to Formula One. Lando is having a very good start to the season. This race in particular has not been his best, but he has been on the podium every single race this season. He won the first race this season. He's been very locked in, and his performance was just not where he wanted it to be this week. Could he have had better performance last week too? Maybe, yeah. But again, I don't think that there is this mental block from him. I think we just had one bad weekend. These things happen. They happen to champions. They happen to Lewis Hamilton. They happen to Max Verstappen. I think we are kind of putting way too much focus on 3 days out of this entire season. And I think there's a big change that could be coming for him. So I think until we actually see him really fall apart, which again, this was still a podium finish, which really shows how strong he's been performing for everyone's response to be that they think he did so poorly when he finished 3rd. I think the championship is very much still within reach. He's still ahead, and he's more ahead of Oscar than he was of Max last week. I think we are jumping to conclusions here. And then one of our last hot takes, Ollie Bearman should have been driver of the day. I'm gonna say I agree with you. I actually really thought this was such a good drive, and I was really frustrated it wasn't televised in the way that it should have been. Lewis Hamilton did have a very good drive. 9th to 5th is very impressive. But at the same time, I think 20th to 10th is very exciting too. And it was a very impressive drive that we just really didn't get to see in the way that I would have liked to. And one of these is how great Pierre Gasly did. I want to say that we did not talk about him much this race, but Pierre is one of these drivers who consistently has these big moments where we have a race where he just suddenly has so much pace and such good ability. This was really one of them, and we should give him props for that drive. And lastly, we have some predictions for next week. Verstappen is going to get a podium. We'll see. But to be honest, you never know. Things have been such a yo-yo for him. Last week he wins a race. This week he has a completely abysmal race, though we know a lot of that had to do with factors that had nothing to do with him. It's possible that we could see suddenly next week it's just a great time again. If that happens, I would like to see Yuki also do some very good stuff. McLaren wins the WCC, but not the WDC. I think George is going to win it at this rate. I personally think right now, at this stage, we're going to still see one of the McLaren drivers take WDC. The question will just be which one. Though, as we said, George has been really performing this season in a way that even frankly surprised me. Oscar WDC and Max leaves RB. This is something that we haven't talked a lot about, but I do think there is a possibility that Max starts to look elsewhere if we don't see Red Bull kind of get it together. But at the same time, with Yuki performing in the way that he is, it's possible that we see a change in that kind of narrative. The thing about Max is that it's very clear the most important thing to him is winning. And so the question is always going to be, where does he have a better chance at winning? Does Red Bull kind of turn things around by the end of the season and prove that he could? Or does Max look elsewhere if things continue to kind of fall apart? Kimi's revenge. I predict a Kimi podium soon. I actually really think that Kimi is going to get his bearings and become really great competition. I do think that this race, he just got kind of stuck from his tire strategy. And I think from the fact that he had actually qualified 4th, we could have seen a really strong race from him this week if we had seen different strategy behind him. We've got predictions for a George pole, a Kimi pole, a Max pole, and a Lando pole. So basically, we think anybody could get it. My hope for next week is that we see Ferrari kind of build on the changes that they made this week that we did see a better success from, that we see Red Bull build similarly, and that we see Lando come back into full performance. The reason why I say this is that for me personally, the most exciting type of Formula One is when we have no idea who could win, when there are tons of contenders for that. And this season so far, we've already seen a lot of people in the mix. We don't go into a race knowing that one car is going to completely obliterate everyone else. Because even as fast as the McLaren is, it is not the type of fast that the Red Bull used to be, where there is just no possibility of ever touching it and nobody else wins a race. Instead, what we have is a very strong car with two very strong drivers that still have competition in drivers like George Russell, in drivers like Kimi Antonelli, where we see multiple cars really performing very well. And then we see these outliers like Pierre Gasly having a sudden run with Alpine like he did this week. My dream for every Formula One season is that everybody is really competitive and that we continually go into every week thinking anybody could win this race. So I would love to see Ferrari become a little bit more competitive, to be one of those questions of like, could one of these drivers win this race? And not just from like that Delulu point that Ferrari fans have. We all have it where you're like, well, this week could be the week. No, I really would like us to see them get to a point where it really could be the week. So my prediction and my hope for next week is that we continue to see good competition throughout the rest of the season. And I hope that that is your hope too, because, you know, as much as we all have biases, I just love good racing. So as always, if you have questions about the race and you want to be able to include them next week, make sure that you are following me on social media on Instagram, TikTok, or Threads, or Facebook, any of those places at Marissa Kumari. You can always find me on YouTube as well, and any of those places you can send in your questions and I will cover them. You can also join the Grid Chat Discord server, which there is a link in the episode description down below for. Not only do I answer your questions and allow you to send in your hot takes, but we also watch the races together, which is a great way to kind of connect with other fans, especially if you're watching Formula One by yourself. And otherwise, I'll see you next week. Thanks for hanging out with me while we recapped Bahrain, and I'll see you for Saudi Arabia next week. I also will see you in person for Miami if you are going to the Miami race, so be sure to let me know if you're going to be there, and maybe we'll do some sort of meetup if there's enough interest. Otherwise, I hope you find me on social media, keep in touch with me for the week, and I'll see you next week for the next race recap.